When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, and welcome back to the Grease Comics YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to be talking about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. So, I had never actually read the book up until this point. I actually still technically haven't read it. I listened to the audiobook done by the actor played by Viserys on the show Game of Thrones. And I will say, right off the bat, before we really get too deep into this, I was heavily surprised with how much I loved this book. It's actually like three kind of novellas made into one in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, but I think all three are very good. They all three add their own interesting spin on the story, and I think that I really enjoyed this series. I am going to be doing, I think, a revamped list for my top A Song of Ice and Fire books. Now, this means lore as well. So let me know if you guys like that idea of seeing me do, I'll probably rank A World of Ice and Fire, this book, Fire and Blood, and then the main series. So let me know if you guys want to see me do that. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to subscribe, like, and comment, please do. It helps the channel grow, reach our people that might like this content as well. And let's get into it. So, right away, I am someone that really liked the first and the third sections of the book. Right, I think the middle is by far the weakest, but I think it's really still really good, which is something that I think makes a bit of sense, right? You have your big kind of hook to get people invested in the story, then you have your middle, which is kind of a smaller story, but it's still really interesting, it gives you a lot of prelude into, I believe, the third kind of part of the book, and the third one's kind of where you have those heightened things going on in a big kind of event. This review will have spoilers for the book, so again, if you don't want that, if you have not read it yet, I would click off of the video. But getting into it, so the first part is something that I think is interesting because it's very much kind of like a lot of fantasy where you have this young guy who's just become a knight. He's very poor. He's a hedge knight, this being Dunk, right? And he's going to this big tourney. There's going to be a lot of people here. This is where he can make his name and get some gold and kind of some place in the world. His dream is kind of being a knight for one of these lords or something where he doesn't have to worry about where he's sleeping or food. And we see this kind of generic start. This is a very generic start that's been used hundreds of times, right? And it kind of takes it a step further where you have this love interest of Dunk, and you're like, oh yeah, Dunk's going to get the girl. He's going to do well in this tournament. He might even win it at Ashford. And we see how that doesn't happen. Now, there's some other elements of the story that I think are interesting for if you were a reader and you did not know that the character Egg or Aegon V was that character until it's revealed. That's a huge reveal within the first section as well. Because we have these two characters that Dunk runs into at like a tavern type place, and one of them is kind of like Dunk assumes is like a stable boy. Now, this is actually Aegon V. Him and his brother Daron, they end up going away from their escort that was supposed to go to Ashford. They're kind of out on their own. We see Daron is kind of drunk, and he's like face down and on like a table inside this tavern where Aegon is outside. We again don't know who either one of these characters are. It's revealed a bit later in the first section. And I think this is a really good introduction because if you're paying attention and you know a lot of the lore, you're kind of rewarded with that, right? Because there's a lot of signs that can kind of point to who these characters are and all of that. So long story short, Egg or Aegon V is, wanting to go with Dunk. Now, Dunk kind of rides this off that this kid is, he's the son of the bar or the tavern woman, and that's not exactly who he is. So Dunk kind of leaves. He doesn't take Aegon V with him, and he goes to Ashford. Now, what I think this chapter does a really good job of, it's an intriguing story already because it's something that it's been done before. We know it works as a story, but George puts his twist on it, right? So where Dunk in this tournament isn't even in it. He at no point participates in this tournament. Not at all. And we see this because of an event that ends up happening. Well, one of the main themes of these three books, or these three novellas that are put into one book, is the idea that the common person is not treated very well in this place, and that's something that's very seen through A Song of Ice and Fire, especially in I think books Feast for Crows. I think it does a really good job on a lot of the chapters showing how poorly the common folk do, along with Arya. And I think this is another way we see that there's a lot of Targaryens at this tournament in Ashford, and the big one here is Aeron Targaryen. He is one of the sons of Maekar. Maekar is someone that becomes king. That is Aegon V's father. And Aeron is not a good guy. He's very much a dickhead. He's a kind of a douche. And he starts kind of like torturing the woman that basically Dunk ends up liking. She kind of does like a puppet like show type thing. And he basically actually breaks one of her fingers, and he's just being a douche, right? Just because, you know, something in this play, quote unquote, offended him, which it's like, it's a puppet play. Like, so more or less what ends up happening is Dunk ends up intervening. Now, with this being said, bad move from Dunk. Dunk is a common kind of hedge knight. He doesn't really have any status. He's very young. And he ends up kind of beating the shit out of Aeron, like kicking him multiple times, or Aeron. He beats him multiple times. And understandably so, Egg also, I forgot to mention, ends up showing up and basically just like, yeah, I'm going to be your squire. He kind of follows Dunk and all of that. And eventually this kind of happens and they kind of, you know, are cool with each other. And then Aegon is the one that ends up going to get help, right, when this starts happening. And this is when it's kind of all revealed that Egg is Aegon V, and the person that he met on the road had also been another one of Maekar's sons, Daeron. Now, because of what happens, right, we have an interesting scenario, because Aeron is going to say one thing to his father, Maekar, and Egg is going to say another, as well as Daeron's going to say something to his father. Now, the thing with Maekar is he's very much not happy with his children. His children have not done much for him. Aeron is kind of a crazy guy. He's really just cruel. Daeron, we've already seen, is kind of a drunk. He's not the best son in the world. And then Aegon V is still quite young, but he hasn't really shown a lot of prowess in sword fighting or anything like that. So it's one of those things where, who is he going to believe, right? The 10-year-old or whatever. I don't remember exactly how old Egg is at the very beginning. Or his two elder sons, who he wants to have more faith in, and he wants Aeron to do good at this tournament. So, yeah, Dunk is in a really bad situation. Now, eventually, what ends up happening is Baelor Breakspear ends up kind of being the person that is kind of helping Dunk. He kind of believes what Dunk is saying and all of these things, and he tries to kind of help Dunk by giving him information about what's going to happen. Now, the punishment is that Dunk is supposed to lose his foot and probably his hand as well, or one of the other. I don't remember if it's one of those two or both of them. And Baelor Breakspear kind of goes, you know, we could do a trial by combat. Dunk is a very big guy, even at this age, that he could have done that instead. Well, that's not end up exactly what ends up happening, and it's more of a trial by 7. So that would mean you would have 7 warriors on one side and 7 on the other. And long story short, you end up having Aeron Targaryen as well as Daeron Targaryen on one side. Those are the two major ones on that side. And on the other side, you have like Dunk and Baelor Breakspear on the other. Baelor is being this last entry onto Dunk's side as he's kind of pleading because he couldn't find 7 people. And throughout this, we have kind of betrayals and stuff like that. And it really twists the normal trope of this story of what you would think the story would be about. It's a really great introduction, and you can really see the impact it's going to have. Because as this ends up happening, Dunk wins it, right? He ends up taking down Aeron, gets him to take his confession back and kind of, or his, I guess, story. And the big thing here is Dunk ends up waking up, and Baelor Breakspear is there, and he ends up dying. His brother Maekar, this is the father of Aegon V, like we've said, ended up hitting him and killing him. So, very big end of the chapter. One of the biggest characters in the Targaryen family at this point ends up dying for Dunk. It's a really strong introduction, and we kind of finish here with Maekar being like, yeah, you can take Aegon the Fifth and all this stuff, and that's kind of the starting of the book. Right now, the second part is a little bit, it's not as like high intensity, it doesn't have as big of an effect on the story, so we're going to kind of gloss over it a bit. But I want to say with this beginning part of the novella, it's a really strong entry because it sets up everything that needs to happen for the next two novellas. And it also does a great job of showing the injustice done to people that are trying to do good and how the common folk are really just shit on, right? Another thing I want to talk about with the end of the first novella is this idea that the love interest for Dunk, she is actually going to Dorne, it is assumed. So it ends up that Dunk and Egg decide to go to Dorne. And that will lead us into the second one. Now, I think going into the second part of the novella, it, out of the three, was the one I was the least interested on. I think the first novella I went through pretty quickly. I went through it about in a day or two, probably. The second one, I paced myself a bit more because it just wasn't as intrigued or involved with the story. I still was, because there's something that's a really interesting element that will also come into the third novella. To the third novella, again, I think it kind of started off a bit slow for me because of coming off of the second one. And then once you kind of get to an area, right, as we'll talk about in that section of the review, it really gets interesting. So the second novella starts with Dunk and Egg. They're in Dorne. They're kind of selling their swords right now, or being hedge knights for this very minor lord. I forget his name, but it's the Checky of Lions or whatever, that kind of house or whatever. And all they basically own is a tower, and there's like a couple villages and stuff. And from Dunk's knowledge, right, this guy is a bit more powerful than he's letting on. Because this guy, that this is the Lord here, is someone that very much revels on the past. And we're kind of led to believe that he's talking about the Blackfire Rebellion, but he was on the Targaryen side, right? That's the way it's kind of hinted at. When you kind of like look at it again, it seems a little bit more obvious that it probably was, that he was with the Blackfires. But at the beginning, you're kind of sitting here through Dunk's eyes and Egg's eyes, and there comes this idea where there's this river. Now, we are in the middle of a drought, right? The last king has now died, and now Aerys the First is now the new king, with Bloodraven as well being the hand of the king. We get a ton of Bloodraven, and we learn a lot about Bloodraven in this two novellas, and Novella 2 and Novella 3, and I think it's really good. It helps give us a lot of context into who the actual character is going into the actual main story in A Song of Ice and Fire. But really, the problem, I think, with the second novella is the entire conflict is built on a river. Now, the Red Widow ends up kind of blocking the river, and which means this river is not going to give any water to the Lord that Egg and Dunk are serving. And this is definitely a problem. In a drought, you don't have any water, which means the crops are going to die, which means you as a whole are going to starve and die. So, big conflict when you look at the common people and what's going on in the context of this novella. But at the same time, when you kind of look at the real conflict, so the real conflict ends up when, again, the first half of the novella really takes a while, in my opinion, to get going. And once you kind of we go to Coldmoot, and we end up having a conversation with the Red Widow, and we learn much more of what's going on here. So the main conflict here, and this is the idea of the second novella that's going to come into play in the third, is that the Lord Dunk is serving isn't actually, he didn't fight for the Targaryens in the Blackfire Rebellion. He fought for the Blackfires. And we're introduced into this major idea of who was the rightful person to take the throne, right? Because we had Daeron, right, who was, by all means, the legitimate Targaryen heir. And we have this idea that Daemon, who is legitimized by Aegon IV, that he has the sword Blackfire. He is the better swordsman. So we have this issue that splits the entire country. And we see this definitely amplified in this novella, right? I think it's Sir Osney, maybe, is the lord that Dunk kind of serves. And he fought for the Blackfires. He uses this argument that he was the better swordsman. He was the one that kept better company, real, fighters with Blackfire and all that stuff. And that Daeron II kind of kept bookish people around him and had, all of these maesters and stuff like that, and had magicians and sorcerers like Bloodraven. So we see that Coldmoot was a group that ends up really getting a lot from this rebellion because of that choice. And we figure out that this river actually doesn't belong to the Chequy of Lion because it was granted away from them. And which is really interesting is that the river is literally called the Chequy River. So this ends up going to the Red Widow. Now, at this point, you're thinking, okay, well, it's still kind of morally bad that she's cutting off water. But at this time, I mean, I definitely was on... I could definitely see a lot more of the Red Widow's side in this, right? Where these are very uneasy times. We see that. Another Blackfire rebellion is going to pop up very soon, even though it doesn't really reach anywhere. But she is using this water to fill kind of the moat on her castle. Now, she has every right to do this. Again, in every law of the Seven Kingdoms, she has the right to do this. Again, still morally kind of gray. Now, what ends up kind of coming of this is that Dunk and Egg, they go back. They're kind of upset by this. They're going to leave, right? They're going to leave, but they kind of decide not to. Dunk decides, this is my responsibility. I need to help with this. And the Red Widow is not willing to give them water, right? So she's kind of going to come over. And there's also something I kind of skipped over at the beginning that kind of also sets this plot in motion, is that the other kind of knight that is with Dunk, that is kind of helping protect his lord or whatever, he ends up cutting on the cheek one of the peasants of the Red Widow, and she demands kind of justice, right? So again, I completely agree. The other dude that was with them was acting like a dick. He was kind of a douche, and he should have been punished. So again, I personally... The thing I like about this chapter is I'm not blindly just on the other dude's side because he's quote-unquote pictured as the good guy, especially early on. And they're not willing to give up this guy, or Duncan Egg and the Lord. They're not really willing to give up this guy. So what ends up happening is we kind of have this standoff. And Dunk kind of takes the punishment. He takes like a cut on the cheek to equal it out. And then there's kind of this trial by combat to see who's kind of right. Dunk ends up winning it in a really awesome final fight. It's the highlight of the novella. And this whole kind of part of the novella is resolved because the two actually end up marrying each other. The Red Widow and the Lord Standfast, they end up marrying. So it's a good conclusion. It just, this chapter is meant to highlight the differences between the Blackfires and the Targaryens, and to kind of highlight how there's still some people that are on the Blackfire sympathizer side, which is something we will get into Novella 3. So, Novella 3 picks up a bit after this time, and the next goal is to head north. Now, they are kind of on their way north. They're trying to get there, him and Aegon, and they kind of get sidetracked, where Dunk kind of sees, hey, there's this tourney going on, I could get a dragon egg. And what I really like about this third novella, I don't want to get too much into it or whatever, but what this one does really well is it shows you the corruption that's already going on within Westeros, and that has always gone on with the higher lords and stuff like that. The common person to really reach a lordship or any type of gain, whether that be politically, monetarily, like through money or through land, is nearly impossible. Because you see this tournament, right? This tournament is a basically, it's a very similar to what the tourney of Harrenhal was going to be, where it was going to be where Rhaegar ends up getting all these lords together, and then they plot to kind of take down Aerys and put Rhaegar as the new king. That's what this tournament is a pretext, or the tournament is a pretext for all of these Blackfyre supporters getting together. And we even see that there actually is a Blackfyre here. Now, that's something that's a big reveal later on, but we continue to kind of get reveals about what's really going on at this tournament, right? This is a tournament that it's very much fixed. We have multiple people trying to fix who they're going against so that they can get deeper into the tournament or for other reasons. And Dunk himself gets completely destroyed in this tournament, by the way. He gets eliminated basically in the first match. He almost dies. So it's interesting the way we see how this kind of goes about. I think this third novella is much better than the second, and I think it's on par with the first. I kind of like the first one a bit better. But the third one's still very good. It's fantastic in my opinion. And we kind of see how Egg is kind of learning, right? He does something that kind of seems dumb to Dunk, but it's actually very smart. Where eventually Aegon kind of gets found out because he uses his boot, which has a ring in it that kind of makes to where he's a Targaryen. People would know that. It's something he references quite a bit. And we kind of continue, and Aegon's like, yeah, well, we were sent here as spies. My father knows about or kind of sent us here to figure this stuff out. And then an army is on the way. It's a great way of kind of using his power to get him out of a bad situation. Eventually, Aegon kind of gets out and brings in Bloodraven and a lot of the armies, and they put down the second Blackfyre Rebellion. So the third novella is interesting in the way that it heightens a lot of the things going on, right? Dunk and Egg basically take down the second Blackfyre Rebellion as a whole, which is a major thing, very impactful to the rest of Westeros. And there's not a lot I want to talk about on it. I think it's just a very solid mystery chapter where we're trying to figure out what's really going on here. And then we get a final kind of conversation to end out the book or novella. Well, I guess both, but with Bloodraven. And I think it's a really good one because it really gives you an insight into Bloodraven and how calculated, cold, and almost cruel he almost is, where he kind of understands how we should handle this Blackfyre, where we should imprison him, keep him kind of as a hostage or a guest almost, because then Bittersteel is not going to be able to name anyone else as the next king while someone else is still alive. We know this plan is going to go awry because Aerys II ends up not really going with Bloodraven's plan, but it's an interesting conclusion and a really good way to end A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and I know there's going to probably be more parts to it, but I think for the three, we've gotten a very good ending of those three. So, my overall thoughts of the book. I think this book is fantastic. I think if you've read the main story or Fire and Blood, you'll really love this book. It's a lot more of it feels like a smaller scale version of like A Song of Ice and Fire. Characters like that. And we almost never really get a character like this in the main story, like Dunk. So, I really enjoyed this book. I think it was really well paced for the most part. I think you get your best pieces at the beginning, the end, and then you kind of get a really good part here towards the back half of the second novella. Because then in the third novella, again, you do have kind of a little bit of that slower downtime where you're building up to the climax of the third part. So I think it's really paced really well. I think the characters are really good. I think Aegon's been very good in this book. Big shout out to Matt Lloyd, who ended up doing the voice acting for the audiobook, which is what I listened to on it. It was fantastic. It really kept me in the atmosphere. I think he does a fantastic job, and all of that. So I think if I was going to give this book a rating, I'd probably say a 9 out of 10. I'd say 8, 9 out of 10. I think anywhere in there. But that's my thing. I think with all these Song of Ice and Fire books, I think the lowest you can put them is like an 8 out of 10. I think A World of Ice and Fire is probably my least favorite, and it's at an 8. So take that as you will. But thank you guys all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Let me know if you want to see more kind of book review type stuff. I went a little bit more deeper into the actual story than I planned to in this review, but I really enjoyed it, and I just got done with it, I think, yesterday for this review, and I will see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.